Okay, welcome to our professional development first session of 2020, really. My name is Josefine Wang. I am the Professional Development Officer for the English Teachers Association of Western Australia, and I am one of the investigators in the Big Picture project, which we'll be talking about today. My name is Claire Jones, and I am the President of the English Teachers Association of Western Australia, and I am also an investigator on the Big Picture project. And today we apologise that this is our first session. Obviously, we would have loved to have met face to face with you all at different stages throughout the first semester of 2020, but that hasn't really been possible. So here we are online in a recorded session, and we hope that you offer comments and feedback to us, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Absolutely. So we're here today to talk about the Big Picture project. So the Big Picture project is investigating subject English across secondary and tertiary education in Western Australia. And this is a joint project between the English Teachers Association of Western Australia and the University of Western Australia. So Josie and I flip between our identities as both members of the English Teachers Association, and we're also scholars here at the University of Western Australia in the English and Literary Studies discipline. So this project sort of combines our knowledge across the secondary sector as both having been secondary teachers, and now we work in research in the tertiary sector. So we're really trying to understand what subject English looks like across different year levels, across different sectors, and across the secondary and tertiary divide. So this project is really about trying to map some of the intersections that we understand that operate within subject English and the English discipline area. So we're trying to map the concepts and standards between secondary and tertiary English. This is quite a challenging thing to do, mainly because, whenever you mention the word standards, everybody recoils slightly. But really, the project is an attempt to investigate the intersections between the secondary and tertiary English fields in Western Australia in relation to subject knowledge, theoretical approaches, and expectations of student performance. Now, this project and these different components of the project have come out of a lot of conversations that we have been part of at different stages, talking to English teachers in the secondary sector, fulfilling our roles as part of the ETA, but also in our conversations with people in the tertiary sector as well, and the clear disconnect that occurs at different stages, even though a student's experience is often connected between these two spaces. So really what we're trying to do is bring these two areas back together and have a bigger conversation. So that's why it's called the Big Picture. The Big Picture project has been divided into sort of three little subcategories. So we have three quite distinct research areas. The first one is creative writing pedagogies. Every time the word pedagogy pops up, there can be different responses to it. And this is even more problematic in the space of creative writing or in any creative arts circumstance, where we are often talking about the differences between practice and learning, and then philosophies towards learning. So creative writing pedagogies we thought was an important project to develop. We also have a project that looks into text lists and teacher choices, which can be similar things. Those choices can be connected to lists. Sometimes they're informing the list, sometimes the list inform the choices. So we're trying to understand the relationships between those two things. And the third is this intersection, mapping the concepts between tertiary and secondary. And really, we talk about this as our nexus project, trying to understand that unidentifiable space that exists between the secondary and tertiary world. So these three parts of the project came out of concerns that we registered at both secondary and tertiary levels in relation to that broader concept of English. Firstly, in the secondary sector, we saw the decline of literature as a course, very rapidly declining enrolment numbers,
as well as literature disappearing as a course at many schools across WA. And so that was something that we were concerned about and wanted to understand exactly why that was the case. We also were aware of an imbalance in the English course, the ATAR English course, between responding and composing, these two integral components of the course, and how people saw them relating to each other, but also how they're weighted within that course. We also understood from particularly surveys of ETA members and what PD that they would like, that people had a lack of confidence in the teaching of creative writing. And people were also concerned about the standard that Year 12s are asked to format in the ATAR courses. We were generally concerned also about early career teachers and the pressures that they face, and the retention rates of early career teachers, and the workload of English students and teachers generally. So these are some of the things that we were worried about at a secondary level, and we actually found quite a lot of overlap at the tertiary level as well. So as we have declining numbers in literature as a course at a secondary level, there are certainly declining enrolments within the discipline of English, whether we talk about it as cultural studies, literary studies, communications, creative writing. It can come in sort of different costumes at different universities, but they all sort of mean the same thing. But there's certainly a decline in enrolments across the board, not just here in WA, not just in Australia, but globally. There's also a concern about first year capabilities, the skills that students come into first year having control over. There is a concern about the breadth of the English course and the focus, or the different foci of the literature course. And just a bit of confusion from the tertiary sector as to how these things get split and divided into these two different courses when they're all combined back together again at a tertiary level, just as they have been from year 7 to 10 if you're teaching in secondary, or from K to 10 if you're looking at the Australian curriculum English. And so there is quite a bit of confusion over concepts, how they're understood at a secondary level and a tertiary level, as well as a lot of concern from the tertiary sector over the declining number of government schools offering literature, and the real knowledge from their first year students that it's not an option for students at schools. The thing I think that alarmed Josie and I, coming from a secondary background and knowing the English course in the way that we did, was that the tertiary teachers did think that there was a real lack of critical thinking in terms of students as they came into first year. And I think that's something that as secondary English teachers, we had always prided ourselves on promoting within an English classroom. Maybe it's not a skill that they actually transfer from the English classroom across into the tertiary classroom. But they were some of the concerns that we thought were worth investigating in a large-scale research project. So that's what we did.
So the way that we conducted the research was that in 2018 there was the Year 12 ATAR audit materials from SCSA. So all schools across WA had to provide their ATAR English and ATAR literature programs and assessment outlines for SCSA to audit. And we were then given access to those materials. So everything was de-identified for us, and from that we could come to some sort of conclusions around the findings that we had. There was also the creative writing pedagogy survey, which was sent out from UWA, and there were 134 respondents across secondary and tertiary teachers. And then we had the literature review as well.
So that was us reading as much as we could about anything and everything written about subject English in Australia, but also globally, particularly in the last 20 or so years, and just trying to figure out, well, what's actually useful to informing what it is that we're doing here in 2019, 2020, and into 2021 as well. So that was our starting point. And at this point, we've presented some of our findings so far at different places. So we've got a list there that you can see of different ways in which we have fed our findings and our observations back to the English teaching community of Western Australia and more broadly in Australia as well with the AATE National Conference in 2019. We've also had some important conversations with SCSA, and they've been really receptive to our project, first in the supporting of the project with the audit materials, but also in being really interested in our findings and finding ways to improve what it is that they offer for English teachers. So phase one, really, this is like the pilot project, I guess. And you can see the web address there. These resources sort of came out of that initial part of the project. We started to see that perhaps some helpful conversations around creative writing pedagogies, the way that we select texts, different disciplinary concepts and conversations about pedagogy generally might be useful to both teachers, and some of these things might be useful for students as well. So these resources will be available soon on the Westerly Research Group website here at UWA, and we'll let you know when they're ready.
So from the data that we received from SCSA, we did some initial data analysis of the documentation that we were given and the TISC annual reports as well. And from that, we could sort of see that the enrolment and performance statistics in English literature and the other relevant subjects were not perhaps what we were expecting to find. I think that we've found some things that we were a little bit surprised by.
Yeah, I think we'd heard anecdotal evidence that, you know, people were seeing this decline in literature, that, you know, there's this comparison between the English subjects and the mathematics subjects and what's going on there, and should we be concerned? Is STEM rising and the humanities falling? All of those sorts of things. And maybe the picture that we uncovered was a little bit more alarming than we originally thought. And yeah, we'll speak to those findings in a moment. As Josie's already outlined, the access that we had to the syllabus delivery audit materials also really interesting. But we sort of had questions around what we should do with those. And Josie did an incredible job with the English materials in unpacking each course and assessment outline and trying to record how a school group might be engaging with the syllabus, how we go about assessing student knowledge and capabilities in relation to the syllabus, but also what texts were being used, as well as the number of assessments that people were actually asking students to complete in a year. And some of that material is work that SCSA has also been doing simultaneously. Most of our results were quite similar, but our work was certainly focusing much more on the engagement with the syllabus itself and the texts that are being studied, as well as a bit of an appraisal of the support materials offered by SCSA too. We also surveyed through the ETA WA membership, as well as our other networks, particularly in the tertiary sector. We surveyed teachers about creative writing pedagogy, and this provided, again, quite an unexpected picture, perhaps more confidence in creative writing than had been expressed by those wanting PD in creative writing teaching. But quite a difference between the way secondary teachers and tertiary teachers understand the ideas of creative writing pedagogy. And that was a bit of a surprise, I think, for us as we unpacked some of those survey responses. We looked at the literature review from different scholarly publications. We've also been interviewing teachers, writers, and academics as part of this project. So all of this information is an attempt for us to map out a clear project and make sure that we find some interesting questions to ask, and then hopefully find answers to those questions so that we can communicate that back to both secondary and tertiary teachers, and hopefully improve what it is that we deliver in classrooms, but provide a lot of support for teachers as well. I'm going to take the lead on the literature numbers here, as this is my little baby. So this is some of the material that we got from the SCSA and TISC annual reports, just looking at what it is that is happening within the literature course itself. And what we can see very clearly is that from 2012 to 2018, there has been a reduction in the number of students studying literature and an increase in the number of students studying English, as we might expect. But I think the thing that is maybe most concerning to me is that we have a larger number of students, or a similar number of students actually, studying EALD as they are studying literature. And if EALD is a course written specifically for a certain group of students with specific needs, that literature is also now in that similar space. So we can see that that cohort, the percentage of the cohort studying literature has dramatically declined. I think the thing that is more concerning for me is the number of schools offering the course. So in 2001, we had 135 schools offering literature to students. By 2018, there were 93. But yet the number of schools offering English has increased quite substantially. But also the distribution of schools, I think, is the thing that alarms me most as a kid from a pretty rough tumble government school who found solace in the literature classroom and certainly looked forward to that period each day, to know that in 2018 only 27 government schools are actually offering literature, but yet Catholic and independent schools had remained very similar, independent schools going up. To me, that's an alarming figure that speaks to a wider social picture, perhaps, rather than simply being about purely an educational question around the funding of courses and what we tend to value in certain cultural circumstances. I think what's also interesting in this section of the statistics that we uncovered is that we don't see a similar picture occurring in some of those STEM subjects. So maths specialist and physics, we don't see that dramatic drop-off in government schools. The number of schools offering those courses is still smaller than some of the other courses, but certainly we don't see the same drop-off that we have for literature, but also we don't see it in visual art or other humanities-based subjects in quite the same way as we do within literature. So again, we're sort of asking questions of what is being valued or what is no longer valued as part of a young person's education in relation to their engagement with literary texts. When we talk to teachers, we often hear that the decline in literature at their school is largely attributed to scoring and the ATAR score that is possible within literature, and the way that the smaller cohort really affects students' results. And certainly they feel more confident recommending students to do English, particularly their sort of mid to high students that maybe they might have recommended literature to in the past, they now recommend English to. And what we can see here are the attrition rates between year 11 and year 12. So we can see, it's really great. One thing that we can see is in 2020, we've got an increase in the number of year 11s enrolled in literature, and that's the first time in many, many years that we see an increase. But we are seeing a sizable attrition rate from year 11 to 12 that's essentially 25% of the cohort moving from literature to English when they move into year 12, and that's clearly a marker of the fear around the assessment. So these are the numbers. What are we doing about it? Well, we've been lobbying as many people as we possibly can, and SCSA has been doing a similar thing. So at the beginning of this year, 2020, there was the acceptable combination announced so that students can study both English and literature. We're also lobbying TISC in hope that we might be able to see some of the bonus marks awarded to literature students in the same way that we see in those mathematics subjects that are considered more difficult than others. So we will see. We'll wait and see, and we'll keep you updated. But this research has been really vital to the case that we've put forward so far, and we hope that we are able to present you with some good news in the future.
Okay, so I'll take over for a little bit here because we're going to talk about the actual audit that we did. So these were from the audit materials that were delivered to SCSA by all schools across WA, as we mentioned before. So we applied for, well, the Big Picture project applied for ethics approval from UWA to actually look at these materials, and then to SCSA for access to the materials, which we were granted, which was incredible. So I think it's worth noting that this has never been done before, and nobody's ever looked at the materials within, well, I guess outside of SCSA and actually having access to this material. So this is a first, which is incredible. Obviously all the materials were de-identified, so we had no idea what schools or teachers were involved in the production of these. And then we really just looked for the information that we thought was going to be useful for us to look at. So that was around the syllabus content, how it was being taught, the sort of approach that schools were taking to it, the assessment structures and how many assessments there were and the kinds of assessments, and also the text selection that was used. So not all of this information was available in every program or assessment outline, but we certainly could get most of this information. And then obviously it's really worth noting that there are some limitations to this data. We're not sure whether the data that was provided to us is exactly what's going to be taught within the classroom, or was it sort of more this is what they're delivering to SCSA as part of the audit, and then they had separate programs that they were going to be teaching. But it did give us a really good overall view of what is happening within ATAR English and literature.
And I guess some of the limitations are to do with, schools that might have multiple classes of a course, writing, sort of a broad outline, an assessment outline that give a picture of what all of those classes are doing, and then each individual teacher being able to tailor it. There were also some that were just unreadable as well. But we also had some really incredible ones at the same time. So a real vast difference in what we were presented with each of the course outlines as well. And in that, there are some problems in trying to present an accurate assessment of those materials when not everything has the same amount of detail or the same criteria being addressed. But we've tried to do as much as we can to be objective with the materials. And we're really grateful to both the teachers that produce them to begin with, but also to SCSA for giving us access to these materials. We have found it incredibly interesting, and we hope that you'll find our findings interesting too.
So the early audit findings that we had in English were, the main thing that we looked for was the organising principles of the program. So the first thing that we looked for was that organising principles. So how were people actually sort of looking at the way that they were going to teach these Unit 3 and Unit 4? Was it going to be unit content? Sort of, were they going to do it around assessment charts, the text charts, or was it going to be more thematic? So as you can see here, there was a total of 197 assessment outlines and course outlines that we looked at. And from those, 155 used the unit content to shape the way that they were going to deliver these units. I think it's good to see that there were only 6 that did it around assessment tasks, and then 28 around the text types that they were going to be teaching, but only 8 had a thematic approach. At least that was clearly discernible. So I don't know if other teachers or other schools were delivering it as a thematic approach or as an assessment task. We don't know, but this was sort of easily discernible. This was thematic, but most of them were across unit content. So another thing that we looked at was the average number of tasks. So the average number was 10.16 plus 2 internal examinations and 1 external tasks, really. There was one school that had as many as 17 tasks, which is a huge amount of tasks for a student to be completing over really 3 terms. And obviously, not just because of this, but there's been national conversation around it as well, but SCSA will be reducing the amount of tasks that students need to be completing over that time. Another thing that we found, which was quite interesting, was that not all assessment outlines obviously had formative assessments because they're not part of the overall grade, but we found that many schools were using the journal as a formative assessment, which we know is popular across many schools, that they use it as a formative assessment, and then perhaps it gets given a couple of marks at the end. And most tasks, in fact, the vast majority of tasks were models of the examination, which I think is a real limit to what the course can offer students. And I think it also shows what teachers are valuing, or at least what schools are valuing, in terms of what students have to produce at the end. And then the final thing that we found, which was this reliance on the SCSA materials, which is not surprising. They are the authority in this, and there was a real reliance on what was being done in terms of tasks. So the Pale Blue Dot was the most taught text, and the stream of consciousness task, which could also be considered a free writing task, was very popular as well. There was a problem with the oral creative tasks, which were put under as responding tasks, which were said to be creative tasks, but were actually responding tasks because students were responding to a text, even though they were creating an oral, it was a responding task. And these were obviously some problematic models that we found in these materials. Okay, so there were some concerns over the English assessment balance, which obviously founded. So what we found in our early findings was that there was a lot of confusion between responding and creating tasks, that teachers were making creating tasks but were actually responding tasks, and these were generally the oral, like we said before. There was very little discernment with with the syllabus selection and the teaching of concepts and units. So some schools had every single syllabus dot point in every unit of work, and others had no syllabus dot points within their course outline. So obviously that makes it difficult to figure out what teachers are actually targeting within that unit of work. There was a bit of pedagogical confusion over creative writing, and this is part of the project that we're working on now, and particularly within what is creative writing, and how does that work within composing and examination. And there seemed to be an idea that creative writing couldn't really be done properly under the examination, which I think we can talk to later. There was a lot of formulaic teaching strategies, which obviously is going to narrow student engagement with the concepts of the discipline. And this is also something that we're seeing at tertiary level, where students are coming in expecting to be given a formula, and from that formula they can produce what the tutor or the course coordinator is expecting. And that I think comes from what's being taught in secondary. And as we said before, there's a real reliance on the SCSA models of assessment. Unfortunately, we don't know whether teachers are teaching these or whether they were submitted for the audit because they knew they would be passed. So I think that's something that we certainly have to be wary of. However, from looking at as many programs as we did, there are certainly some of these assessments that have been copied word for word and put directly into programs that appear to be used within the classrooms. And that's problematic because there are some aspects of those assessments which are not quite right in terms of the methodology, the terminology that they're using, and the way that they are assessing some of those concepts. But I think was really interesting was that there was a real WA text list, and there was almost this idea of WA having its own canon almost being coming through, which I think was quite nice. And I think it even more present in the literature course than it is in English. And then something that we found looking at both literature and English was that there's a bit of an overlap happening between the two courses and the way that they're being taught.
Yeah, particularly in relation to the texts that are being taught in both of those courses. And so this gives you an idea of some of those texts. So the pale blue dot is obviously a model assessment task that is the Carl Sagan passage for people to read and do sort of a sample comprehension style response. But then we really see, this WA flavour coming through with No Sugar and Jasper Jones, which, is an interesting selection, both of which point towards some really specific considerations about West Australian society, our past, and the way that we understand race within our community. Then we get a real sense of dystopia / speculative future /
fantasy / science fiction.
And this was one of our concerns, I think, about these particular types of texts and the way that they were unpacked within the teaching programs that we looked at, or the course outlines that we looked at, is that those differentiations between those different genres were quite blurred. And I think that's most problematic because they were being described as genre studies as well. So that idea and understanding around genre as a concept and then how we might understand different genres seems to be a little bit confused in some of the materials that we looked at. But again, we see Australian texts returning. So The Secret River, The Drover's Wife, Neighbours. The other thing, aside from SCSA materials, which the ones in yellow are all listed on the sample course outline, as well as the pale blue dot at the top. These seem to be listed, again, as Josie mentioned earlier, we're unsure if some of these things are listed simply as an acknowledgement that if the authority approves this particular text, well, then it must be okay for us to study. So we're going to put it in the course outline, whether we're using it or not. I really hope for Dave Wish-Wilson's sake that Perth is being taught widely and he's going to make a fortune on that. But we'll wait and see. But yeah, it does give you a real sense that there are particular popular texts that are being studied in multiple schools throughout the state, and anybody that has been an ATAR marker or that might work between different schools would be aware of that as well. So that we've sort of got our own little local canon occurring within the ATAR English course. So the SCSA models. We were really lucky to have a meeting with the SCSA executive about our project, and they were very receptive to our analysis of the SCSA models that have been both the assessment samples and the course outlines in relation to English. And they understood the way in which teachers are blending, composing and responding classifications in assessments, even though there's a requirement within the course for those weightings to be awarded separately. And this was something that the Course Advisory Committee had alerted both SCSA to as well as our project to, and we were certainly more than happy to investigate that and report back to them that indeed that does seem to be the case from the data that we had available. And they were also interested to hear from us that a lot of these assessment samples had problems in relation to course concepts, stylistic features and language features, how they are represented within the course, how students are being asked to deal with these concepts in external assessments or the examination, and how they're actually used within these SCSA models. So SCSA have recently amended the outlines, and they're working to provide new samples with a working party that Josie and I were lucky enough to be part of. So hopefully the next round might guide us in a slightly different direction, and that will also conform to that reduced number of tasks that Josie spoke to earlier.
So I think that there are some general points that need to be considered here, which are some questions that we've asked of ourselves, asked of each other, and tried to ask of the data, and we're not quite sure where we're sort of going next. So we looked at, there were quite a few Australian texts, which I think is great to see that they're being incorporated into the teaching of English, but we don't know how they are being incorporated. We don't know if they're primary texts or secondary texts or the way that they're being taught or what's being looked at. We couldn't get that information from the data that we had available. As Claire mentioned earlier, there's some confusion in terms of genre studies and their definitions. We saw quite a lot of speculative fiction being taught as dystopian or fantasy, or dystopian being taught as fantasy. And I think it's problematic only because when it comes to the exam, students are going to write about it. They're going to be writing the wrong things, and obviously that's going to be problematic in their assessment. We also saw that adaptation and transformation is still sort of a point of a bit of a contested point. Even when we were at the SCSA working party, we did try to sort of have a chat about it, and still very capable English teachers were unsure of what quite the definitions and the differences between those two. As are we. We have a great Tim Tam experiment that you can ask us about if you would like. And then something that I'm quite passionate about is the reading of film as a visual text, and how exactly is that being done, and is it being done to supplement the novel? Is the film of the novel being taught
as a replacement to the novel?
Exactly, as a way of getting the reluctant readers to partake in the story, which I think is problematic, because it's going to give students who have read the novel, they're not going to be able to talk about quite as much.
I think there's also a component here of how do we read that against syllabus content, because our syllabus content speaks about the construction and the reading of the text being the same, whether we're dealing with a visual text or a print text or whatever it might be. And it's hard in those syllabus materials, the course and assessment materials, to make that clear distinction by using syllabus dot points. So it's sort of one of those things that we're still unclear of, and we'd love people's feedback.
Yeah, we'd love to know more about what people are actually doing, because, as Claire mentioned, we're not in the classroom at the moment, so we are sort of looking from the outside in, and we would love to know what teachers are doing. And then I think that one of the things that we were kind of going is, well, what is it that's missing? And one of the things that Claire mentioned earlier was that tertiary educators are finding that students are coming in with a lack of ability to really critically think.
And we said, no, that's not the case. It can't be.
We absolutely did not agree with that. But unfortunately, from the audit materials, it became quite clear that there was not really a lot of scope for critical thinking. Particularly when you're basing everything on the exam, you are looking at a particular way of writing, and therefore possibly a particular way of thinking. And I think that it's problematic when students are being limited in terms of their abilities to critically think. And then another thing that we found was definitely missing was that writing being taught as a craft rather than just a response to a text. And that probably comes from the examination, that there is that 63% that comes from it being a response rather than it being a creative writing, or interpretive or persuasive writing.
And that sort of mismatch between the course weightings of responding and composing, and then the examination weightings of comprehending, responding, and composing, really does seem to have a huge influence over not simply the way in which course outlines and assessment outlines are written, but just in the way that you see students only being given one attempt at a creative process. And I think, from our work into creative writing pedagogies, but also in what each of us know about the process of writing, that's a really reductive method, but we understand why that's occurring. And that sort of leads us to what's most noticeable when you look at all of these course outlines together, and that's the examination. The examination is front and center in every one of these courses. We understand the reason for that. But still, in our more objective position, looking at this in relation to education theory and how we understand the processes of learning, we know that to be problematic. That's not saying we're not criticizing teachers for doing that. We understand the pressures that they're under, but as a broader educational experience, we are questioning that.
And it's quite reductive in what it provides our students. And I think that when it becomes about the examination, unfortunately you're taking away so much of what we actually love about the subject for our students. And I think that's probably a little bit of a sidetrack.
We'll get to that in
we'll
another
get that
PD.
Later.
There's also this very noticeable local canon, which we'll speak about in a moment when we look at some of the literature material. There are also quite specific gaps in the teaching of the syllabus, certain dot points that are often overlooked. And there are some really amazing unit outlines that manage to cover everything in really dynamic and interesting ways, making me wish I was a student in one of the classrooms where that course is being taught. So overall, a really interesting process for us, and we hope to be able to provide this feedback more formally soon in a publication so that people might be able to think about these things when they next review their courses. On to literature for a moment, and it's only a moment because we haven't finished all of our analysis of the literature unit course and assessment outlines. But really what we have looked at are the texts, and there's a reason for that, and that's because most of the literature courses are organised around texts, which will come as no surprise to those who teach within the literature course. But what we do see here is some very, very clear winners in the race for the most popular texts being studied in literature in WA. And so Handmaid's Tale was also on the English popular text list, as was No Sugar, as was The Secret River, and some of the others appeared at different stages as well. But we can see really clear, we had 88 sort of usable course outlines and assessment outlines where we could easily match the course and the assessment outline together from the same school. Some of them we just weren't able to do that with the way that the data was presented to us. Some were unclear or unfinished, but so we had 88 that we could use. And we can see, Australian texts do get a pretty good go, so 40.4%, which is great. But of course, the way in which Australian texts are dealt with within the ATAR course is really quite specific, and that's because of particular dot points in relation to national and cultural identity that are part of the course. And we see the way in which these Australian texts usually fit within a post-colonial perspective. And it's obviously part of our current context and a really valuable perspective to be offering to students. But you can also see within the course documents the different ideological perspectives or reading positions that are also promoted within schools, and we see a lot of a very similar ideological position being offered throughout many of the texts that are being studied. And you sort of wonder to the effectiveness of that at different times in a student's study of these texts, or whether it becomes an overwhelming ideological position as well. So 42 Indigenous writers represented in that group of Australian writers as well. And that does appear to be something that's growing. Tim Winton, the WA local, is studied in 25% of schools. Shakespeare is in 61.3% of schools, so being the most popular producer of texts, which is probably no surprise yet again. But it is across various Shakespearean plays and one school studying sonnets. So that's. But I actually expected to see more than 61%. I was surprised at that. But I do think what's interesting here is the overlap between literature and English and the number of schools studying. It would be interesting to know the number of schools studying the same text in both their English and literature classrooms. So moving on to an additional part of our project, so the creative writing pedagogies category of our project. So last November and December and January this year, we had open a survey for both secondary and tertiary teachers, and I've updated that today to the 145 responses that we had in that time. So really, one of the things that people, well, we were surprised to see the number of people relatively confident about teaching creative writing, but it was really interesting to see the differences in the way people had been trained in creative writing or not trained in creative writing, as well as the things that they tended to value within creative writing or the types of forms that they considered to be creative writing. So we had people teaching across both secondary and tertiary. And you'll notice from the results as well, you know, a lot of the time people are teaching in both years 7 to 10 and 11 to 12, or if they're tertiary, they might be teaching undergraduate and postgraduate. We even had one respondent who teaches across year 11 and 12 and undergraduate. So, you know, a bit of crossover in those different areas. But this was something that I think wasn't unexpected, but just an image that draws our attention to how creative writing hasn't been a substantial part of subject English for very long. You know, it certainly hasn't been at a tertiary level. In actual fact, creative writing was always a much stronger component of the secondary curriculum than it has ever been in the tertiary sector, and certainly wasn't seen as part of an academic discipline until quite recently in the tertiary sector. But we can see here that there are a lot of people that didn't necessarily do this as part of their training, and I'm certainly one of those people. Josie is on opposite. Do you want to?
Sure, I can talk about that. So I did creative writing as part of my degree. So I certainly did say that, yes, I have been trained as a creative writer, but this is quite a while ago. It is almost 14 years ago. So I think that the way that creative writing is being taught at the tertiary level, particularly from my conversations with Claire about how she's currently teaching it, it's definitely changed. And I think that there's a lot more theory around creative writing now than there was, or perhaps that I took in when I was being taught to be a creative writer.
I also thought the to some degree response was really interesting. And I wonder if a lot of that is people who have always enjoyed creative writing themselves, sort of taking that in as part of their training to become a teacher, or whether that was part of perhaps a Bachelor of Education where some of those units are a little bit more open in relation to talking about creative practice, particularly in an educational context.
Could it be professional development?
Absolutely.
As you've gone through, you know, perhaps you've done some creative writing, professional development, and everyone in this is still becoming a teacher. You know, you're never quite finished doing your studies.
No. So this gives us a picture of the types of writing forms that people consider creative. And it's interesting to see, you know, the types of writing that seem to be valued as a creative form of writing, and then perhaps others that are not valued to the same degree by a larger group of people. And I found it really interesting, you know, particularly when we think about our ATAR English examination and the term imaginative writing. We tried to represent everything in the survey that maybe would be part of that imaginative writing experience, but yet teachers rank them all quite differently in relation to what they consider creative writing forms. So we've got a little bit more work to do here to unpack this with some more feedback from teachers about why this picture looks the way that it does and why, you know, persuasive argument isn't considered the same as short story, or why prose still ranks that little bit lower than short story. So yeah, lots of different things to think about. There was a different if you look at the tertiary respondents to this survey, there's a different picture to the secondary teachers as well, with certainly sort of these more interpretive or transactional texts not ranking nearly as highly as they do in the secondary sector, which is probably what you would expect to see considering the way that creative writing is defined in a tertiary sense. So this picture just tells us a little bit about how confident people feel when assessing student capabilities in creative writing. And I think this was unpacked in comments as well. People could give comments later on about what they found really difficult. A lot of people spoke to being concerned about objectivity in marking creative work as well, and particularly about their own preference in writing styles and forms. And I do think that that is a consideration. I certainly am always mindful of that working in creative writing at a tertiary level, that there are certainly genres and forms that I feel more comfortable in. But I think that if we'd taken this survey 3 years ago, we would have seen a really different idea in relation to confidence. And I think that teachers are growing in confidence in relation to creative writing and certainly the assessment of creative writing. I also wonder if from our unpacking of the audit materials, how people see this idea of assessing creative writing based on the examination. And we know the examination has quite a limited scope for each question in relation to criteria that they can mark against. And while that is part of providing an objective marking position for markers, how that might limit also student performance in these in relation to creative. So people talked about their limitations in teaching creative writing. The biggest one was time and emphasis allocated, as well as students reading. And I don't think that this is any surprise to anybody who is in a classroom teaching creative writing, but that idea that there is not enough time to be able to do justice to the process of creative writing and to really engage productively in creative writing pedagogy, that is a real concern for a lot of these people responding to the survey, and certainly a concern for us as we've been going through the audit materials. But also the idea that students that read are probably going to be better writers. So, people sort of in comments to this section as well, sort of saying, if only they would read a little bit more, I think that I'd be able to teach them to write better. And I think that's probably a familiar scenario
Absolutely.
for most teachers.
Yeah.
So finally, in relation to creative writing pedagogies, there are distinct differences between the secondary and tertiary understandings of this area, this field. And there's also really big differences between different tertiary institutions and how they see the relationship between literary and cultural studies and creative writing. And if we think that literary and cultural studies and creative writing make up subject English, we can see that there's always going to be tension in subject English between the way that we respond to text, so literary and cultural studies, and the way that we produce or create text, the creative writing component of this. So if institutions that, if a department within a tertiary institution has these tensions, it's not surprising that us as classroom teachers have our own tensions as well. There's also there doesn't seem to be a lot of discussion around creative writing pedagogies, and certainly, and I don't mean this purely at a secondary level, that it's actually really hard to research this because they're actually just in the process of being defined by a lot of creative artists, not just creative writers, but creative artists, how they understand their process and how we can talk about that in an educational sense. How we can actually how we can ascribe a teaching philosophy to this practice is something that is really cutting edge at this point in time. So not surprising that classroom teachers, with all that they do, aren't necessarily across everything that's going on. So our question is, can a clearer articulation of creative practice and specific explanations of pedagogy support classroom teachers? And that's what we would like to know from people. If we could do this face-to-face, we'd stop here for a question and let you give us some responses. But please feel free to respond to us and tell us would it be helpful to have this clearer expression of what we do when we teach creative writing? So where to now?
So this is where we are headed next. So I'm not sure that we mentioned it at the beginning actually, but this is obviously part of the ETARY have funded this project that we're currently working on. And based on our findings from phase 1, this is then phase 2 that we have started and we are working on at the moment. So based on our findings and our research and the survey and everything that we sort of have been looking at so far, these were the 8 unit MOOCs that we have proposed that we will be completing. So this is where we've received some funding from the ETA and obviously UWA as well supported us.
So just a MOOC is a massive open online course. So these are going to be units that teachers can enroll in free of charge and participate in. You know, it's not high stakes. You don't have to be writing a thesis or anything like that. But it's an opportunity for us to offer PD based on what we know to be either problematic in terms of the research that we've done or would potentially be of benefit to teachers in the classroom from all of our connections and discussions with teachers around the state.
And also I think it's important to mention that this is something that we're trying to do that teachers don't have to just go and sit in a PD session. It is a course that they can do in their own time when they feel that they have time within the areas that they feel that they want to know more. So that's why we've come up with these 8 units. So the first ones that we're focusing on are
young adult fiction. So that will be a unit with me and Tanya Delzil, who is the discipline chair of English here, English and literary studies at UWA, and programming and planning,
which will be delivered by me and Claire as well. So this will be coming out through Coursera, and we are hoping that the first units will be available in November. Obviously, COVID-19 has put a spanner in all works, all timelines have been sort of pushed back. But also we will be putting out some publications, and we have started recording our podcast, which is called Think It Over, Think It Under, which will also be coming out as soon as we figure out how to get that out to people. There'll also certainly be conference papers and PD sessions if you choose to attend and know more about this project. And
we've also got a couple of additional projects to try and find more data, try and find more information, but also to try and offer a broader picture of some of these things that we've been discussing in the Big Picture project. In particular, we're going to be looking at literary language and how particular discourses operate in our subject. And we're also going to be looking at the stages of literary knowledge, trying to map what a student does and understands from year 11 and 12 into first, second, third year university level as well. So how that continuum actually operates for the student experience rather than always thinking of it from the teacher's perspective. So this is what we're going to be working on, and we always welcome feedback, contributions, and we hope soon to be seeing you face to face.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having a listen, having a look, and figuring out what we're doing.
We hope to see you soon.